Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Connections podcast, where we talk about maintaining our relationships on Allah's terms. I'm your host, Fatma Qadri, here with my co-host, Dr. Fariha Khan.
Thank you for being here today. Today we're talking about sexual responsibility versus spiritual abuse. So I'm going to start by reading a short passage from an article by Dr. Fariha Khan called Sexual Responsibility. And in this article, you coined the term sexual responsibility. And I want to talk further with you about why you chose this term and how you came to describe it in that way. So just to start off with this short passage, having such a culture of taqwa ingrained into the practice of Islam in America would help the male scholars to write just as it would help women. There are, in fact, many ulama in America who do take measures of taqwa when teaching and interacting with their female students. Then you go on further in the article, giving examples of how some male scholars I think that the first example that you had mentioned in here was about how a male scholar would meet his female student in the middle of the masjid with the curtain between them, and sometimes her husband would also be present. So can you talk a little bit, maybe start by the example you used and what you took from that?
Yeah, well, actually, so this article was not where I coined the phrase sexual responsibility. This is an older article I wrote before the sexual responsibility piece. And in this the piece that you just read from, it's actually the article on Sila's website called Reconnecting with our Scholars Upon the Plane of Taqwa. And I mean, what I was doing in that piece was trying to bring attention to the fact that when we if we see, so I wrote this article in a time that it was actually, there was quite a bit of stress among the Muslim American community regarding interactions between certain male scholars and their female students. So the reason I wrote it is because I noticed kind of like a lopsided way of talking about the matter of how male scholars and female students should interact. And a lot of the emphasis was on the behavior of the ulama, of the scholars, which of course is in its place. I mean, they are in a place where they are held responsible by the community and by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for conveying the deen. But like the fact that there wasn't talk about what the female students needed to do. But with the passage that you read, what I'm talking about there is the need for like creating a culture of taqwa in general among Muslim Americans. So, if you remember in the earlier part of the article, I talk about how we as American Muslims were kind of going more and more toward a liberalization of our practice of the deen in the United States. So, these incidents that you mentioned, like the one that you just quoted, that was actually myself. So when I was a grad student, and I was going through legal texts regarding marriage and divorce and Islamic law, and I needed to go through this kind of really dense text. It was both in Urdu and Arabic, and it was it was pretty intense, like the fiqh of it. So I needed help. I asked a local scholar who was highly trained. He was a mufti, and I asked, would you be able to read this text with me? And he graciously obliged. He was very supportive. Oftentimes there's like this idea that male scholars are not really supportive of giving women time, or they don't want to impart the same kind of knowledge, like the high level stuff that they would to male students. And I didn't find that to be the case. I found, in this case and in other cases as well, that the ulama are really concerned for women to learn the deen and to understand matters of the deen. And so he gave me time, but he set his parameters, right? He was like, we're going to meet after, I guess it was Isha prayer. I don't remember exactly, Maghrib or Isha prayer. I remember it was evening. And how he had me do it was, we would meet right in the middle of the prayer hall. You imagine like this big masjid prayer hall where the men normally pray Jummah prayer, like huge hall, right? But in the week, it was like a weekday, probably a Wednesday or something. So not many people around. And he would have me sit right in the center of it. Both of us were on the floor. He sat across from me, and my husband was usually almost 99% of the time. Maybe there was one occasion when he wasn't there, but I'm not even sure about that. But then there were other people around in the masjid. And he would sit off to the side doing his own stuff. And myself and this sheikh, we would go through the text together, and then I mentioned later on in that same passage, a friend of mine who, when she was getting her ijaza in tajweed, mashallah, she has her ijaza in the 10 qira'at. And when she was getting her ijaza, he wouldn't, her teacher was a different scholar. He wouldn't communicate with his female students on the phone. Either you would talk to him like in class in person, or I don't know, maybe they used to email or something, but like he didn't want to have even phone conversations because of the familiarity that would breed. It's not haram for a man and woman to talk on the phone if there's a need, but he took these measures. And so I think having as it says in the passage, having a culture of taqwa ingrained into the practice of Islam, where it's normal for us to do this, would really go a long way in preventing odd things from happening. Because right now, these kind of taqwa-centered practices are not normal. They're looked at like, why is he so strict? And, this is a
Yeah,
barrier
because
for women. Yeah.
as you're describing this, I'm thinking, if we were to talk about this like on a normal day in a normal setting, these examples sound so extreme. Like, wow, like a parda, he can't even talk on the phone. That especially like in the West, like when we're talking about interactions between men and women, it just sounds so extreme, and so even some might describe it as backward. But then when something goes wrong, we go to the other extreme of
Well, which extreme? We
blaming
don't actually go to a religious extreme, do we? I
of
mean,
demonizing the ulama, and
yeah. Mm-hmm.
of putting them in this light. Oh, like they're predators, or or almost, I mean, if you don't mind, like if we can get into the term of spiritual abuse, and why like you were making this reference that sexual responsibility should be used over the term spiritual abuse, because it kind of I think this is a good point to get into that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Fatma, first of all, like based on what you just said, we have to think about the fact that the ulama do have an extra responsibility. I mean, so a lot of the rhetoric that is going around right now, after, whatever recent kinds of topics that have been brought up in the community, there were these, there's a lot of discussion about the fact that the ulama are more responsible, that they have a greater responsibility to make sure that they don't do wrong when it comes to the sexual arena, in terms of gender interaction and things like this. And they're absolutely correct. I mean, it's some of the ulama themselves who are saying this. Like, subhanAllah, I was like shown this one clip of a scholar. He's talking about when, he heard of a case where there was someone who was a Quran teacher, and he used his position as a Quran teacher to abuse a child, right? Somehow, there was, and so this scholar who I was listening to online, he asked his own teacher, what is the hukum on such a person? He's a married man, and he uses the Quran to lure people into, women into, inappropriate sexual kinds of situations. What's the hukum for that? And his scholar told him the hukum is the person is killed. He should be killed. Like if you were in a proper, a land where there is rule according to the Sharia, the hukum would, according to this scholar at least, he felt it was that egregious a problem, right? So it's not a joke. It's not a joke when someone abuses their position in that way. See, I don't want to use that phrase, abuses. This is actually the whole podcast is about not using that term, but we'll get to that in a second. But my point is, it is really, really serious to when someone is a scholar, when someone is in a position of religious authority, to not uphold that, and instead to do fahish behavior, and like to do things that are completely, absolutely contrary to the, to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. It's really, it's bad. I mean, there's no doubt about that, right? And, even the classical scholars, they talk about why that is. But, you're asking me about why my personal feeling on this matter is that I think it's better as a community for us to talk about things in terms of sexual responsibility rather than to talk about the problem of spiritual abuse. So the end goal of it is still the same. The end goal is that people uphold what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, that we work to prevent inappropriate things, incorrect things from happening between men and women, or inappropriate sexual things to happen. But how we conceptualize that and how we think about that, I think we really need to revisit it. And I'm just, I'm actually very uncomfortable with the phrase spiritual abuse. I'm really uncomfortable with that. So,
You mentioned that the scholars have a higher responsibility to uphold modesty and to uphold the Sharia. And while we're quick to be angry at scholars and so I guess perhaps that is why we feel so angry when we hear these stories, because we do hold them in a higher regard. We do respect them so much more. And so when these things happen, we have higher expectations. So, but at the same time, I think sometimes when we do interact with scholars, we do overlook that they are human and they have human desires, and they will have human reactions to certain situations, right? So for example, if somebody is going to speak to a scholar dressed in a certain way, we might think oh yeah, but he's a scholar and I'm just getting advice from the sheikh, and maybe not think about the reality that, hey, this person's also human, and I also have to practice a certain level of care and restraint and modesty when I am seeking the advice of male scholars. And a lot of your writings, you talk about, these meetings you've had with male ulama, and you've gotten advice or you reference knowledge you've taken from them. I guess I want to know, what are some measures that you've taken when you go into these meetings to meet with a scholar as a recipient of knowledge, and how you take your own precautions, keeping all of this in
right.
mind.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Fatma, what you just said is potentially very offensive to a lot of women. And I think it's important that we acknowledge the fact that our current culture in America or in the West, if we talk about how women have if you're gonna go talk to a scholar dressed in a certain way, and he is human. I mean, what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, what you're saying is right. But the thing is, I mean, it's this reality that we have to, as a community, we have to find a way to talk about this that is more honest and more true to our tradition, more true to our deen and to the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the way in which he commanded us to carry ourselves as women, as men, with each other. And I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that we were human, there would be no Islam, right? Like if we were angels, the angels are not accountable. They are going to do the thing. They're going to do the right thing regardless, because they are not able to choose. What makes us human is the fact that we're able to choose how we carry ourselves, how we behave with each other. And one of the reasons why I feel it's almost like demeaning to the status of women to say that it's all the male scholar's responsibility. I don't know if anyone actually says that, but it seems like it. It seems like it from the term spiritual abuse. We haven't talked yet about why I don't really like that term, but we'll talk about it in a second.
Seems like it's assumed,
It's assumed that they have, they're the ones who have to do everything right, regardless of what the woman is doing. And, I don't know if that's what you're doing when you do that is the woman is just, is she incapable of also upholding her end of the bargain? Do we as women not have a role in society to make sure things go well and make sure things go right, in terms of behavior, in terms of interactions, in terms of, preventative measures? I think we have a role, and I think we have a lot more agency. I mean, this word agency is much more from a Western liberal tradition, right? But we do have the ability given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to look for and cultivate the good in our societies, just as men do. And I think it's better to put it in, maybe that would help us as Western women sort of understand like why I'm talking about sexual responsibility and why it's a two-way street, and I don't really want to talk about spiritual abuse. So, I mean, with spiritual abuse, what we're doing when we talk about spiritual abuse is automatically when you say spiritual abuse, there's this idea that something's going to go wrong, and we have to make sure I mean,
But I mean,
it's, yeah.
somebody would say that, well, the term spiritual abuse comes from someone who used their role as a spiritual leader
Mm.
to abuse someone. So why one would argue with you, like, why not just call it what it is? Like, what is so problematic with this term that you are like advising us to refrain from using it?
Yeah. Well, okay, so I'm just gonna talk it out with you and you can tell me what you think. But like one of the things that I think about when we think about spiritual abuse, the term abuse, first of all, it indicates a power differential, right? It indicates that someone has a greater position and someone has a lower position. When we're talking about abuse, we're talking about a stronger person or a superior person who is taking advantage of a weaker person or a more vulnerable person. And this perhaps would be okay as a term to use, except in the context of, the way Westerners think about power and who, in hierarchy and who is above and who is below. As Westerners, we have a natural tendency to distrust and to be wary of people in positions of power, right? I mean, this is what the egalitarian streak of liberal thought is all about, is like, how do we check those who have greater power and how do we expand rights and duties, I mean, rights and what you could say like access, so that other people who don't have as much power are empowered. Why do we like this term empowerment? Because we want those who are weaker to become just like those who are in power, so that eventually everyone becomes the same. And as Muslims in our tradition, we don't have that as a moral imperative. We don't have a moral imperative to check those in power. In fact, we have the opposite. We have the imperative, those who are above us, we are supposed to honor them in their position. We're supposed to look to the people who are above us for protection without any shame, or knowledge without any shame, and without any resentment for the position and the power and the authority that they have.
It's funny you say that, because like in the West, I do think that although our language does not show this, we do expect that from our leaders,
What?
because we do expect them to protect us and guide us and all of that, but we just don't use the respectful language and tone and attitude towards it. And like, and the reason I'm saying this is because when things go wrong, immediately like the fault is always at the leadership, or the blame is always at the leadership. But we don't use language like, yeah, like this is my boss and this is what they expect me to do, so I'm gonna just, like, there's Buttercup and me just listening. Like we don't think like this is your boss. Like, if they're kind of like in this category of like it doesn't have that same attitude or tone that we do say perhaps like in other parts of the world. But the expectations are still there towards the leadership, which perhaps makes it even
Maybe.
harder, because we're not giving them the respect, and like the relationship is not there,
Yeah.
but it still has
I
to
mean,
function.
it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I wouldn't say as a Muslim we're expected to just sort of obey them, oh, because he's my boss. It's not necessarily like that, but it's uh
But there is a level of compliance that you're expected to have with people who are
yes,
preside over you as leadership.
until and unless the Sharia is violated. Yeah.
Yeah, like you're not as a Muslim, you're not supposed to go in with unnecessary defiance or unnecessary critique, unless they're in the wrong or they're making bad decisions. And then you can respectfully say, hey, this is not good for the company, it's not good for our organization, or etc. But we don't enter the conversation with critique, and it just makes things a lot harder.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, like, if we're gonna start talking about spiritual abuse more and more as a common concept, right? A common term. Like among American Muslims, we take a stand against spiritual abuse. Let's say that becomes our byline for the Muslim American community, right? What does that say about who we are as a community, what we expect from our leaders, what we expect from our ulama? I mean, you would have traditionally, historically, within the Muslim world, you have automatic sense of respect that, as you said, is there between those who are taking from those ulama and the ulama themselves, right? So you show them respect, you show them deference, you show them honor. Even if it's the ruler, you show them a level of deference, or you're grateful for what they're giving you as in terms of protection and safety, where you live in a land where there's aman, where there's security and safety, and that person is primarily responsible for making sure you can go to work and educate your children and make ends meet without having to worry about your house always being broken into, and there are riots and people getting killed all the time, right? So I mean, we have this like sense that we respect those above us. And if we're going to say, oh, we as American Muslims, we take a stand against spiritual abuse, first of all, you're saying that spirituality of people is in the hands of others. It's not between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know, regardless of what your particular strand of Islam is, Islam, your spirituality is between you and Allah. Even those who have like a spiritual sheikh, for example, right? If he's a proper sheikh, he will tell you, you need to make sure that you are watching your nafs, watching yourself, making sure. I can't sit there and look at what you're doing in the privacy of your own home, in the privacy of your own mind, right? So what does it mean to say spiritual abuse, like my spirituality is in the hands of someone else? I mean, I remember, Fatma, I think you were telling me the story about how someone in your family heard about a scholar acting sort of funny, and she was just like, well, what was that? Like, what, the woman shouldn't study with him or something, and it wasn't like, oh, he's a scholar, you should still listen to him. No, I mean, the Sharia comes first, right? The basic knowledge of the deen, which should be intrinsically there amongst us, should come first.
Yeah, it's like
And
an instinctual response, like the sky's falling, stay away,
so,
But so, okay, so if we don't use the term sexual abuse, I'm sorry, spiritual abuse, then what is it correct? What is it? Then how do you describe this?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, so a little bit more about why spiritual abuse, I think, is off. The power differential, it's fine for the Muslim mindset, but it's not fine for the Western Muslim mindset, right? So when we are in this in-between space where we're both Western and Muslim, we start saying spiritual abuse, what are we saying? Like, are we saying that we don't want, that we distrust the position of people above us? I think talking as a community in this way eventually will lead us to a place where we will not have any sense of deference, right? So that's one thing. Who cares about deference? Why are we even talking about deference? Number one, it's because the scholar serves as our first connection to the Quran and Sunnah and to the Deen of Allah, right? I mean, if we are going to write out or cut out the position or the place of those who have religious knowledge from over us, what's eventually going to happen is we're going to be left with no real direct way of understanding our deen. So I think people can understand why respecting the scholars from that perspective, why it's really important. And and by talking in terms of our stand against spiritual abuse, we are also indirectly sort of implicating men negatively even more than they already are. I mean, I think in the kind of liberal feminist kind of culture that we live in, men are more and more seen as circumspect, as potential abusers, not as potential protectors, which is the language that the Quran uses, that the men are the qawwam over the women. That idea is not there. Instead, the idea is, oh, we just make sure that he's not going to do something wrong, because he has such a tendency, all of those men out there, you know what I mean? And it's like, if we're going to go down that route, we're going to be in the same boat as, what's happening. Did you hear about, like, in this post recent election, now there's like American women who are swearing off ever having any relations with men, like physical sexual relations until this law is put back in place and that law is put back in place. And it's like, our attitude toward men is becoming more and more, by the day, is becoming more and more poisoned. So why, this is like basically in a nutshell, like these are some of the reasons why I think talking from a negative perspective, talking from a victim-centered perspective, spiritual abuse is talking from a victim-centered perspective. We're talking about, the sexual arena, like meaning
Right. Somebody would hear what you're saying and they would think you're being so protective of the abuser. You're being so careful in your terminologies and language towards the abuser. You're undermining the pain of the victim.
Undermining the pain of the victim. Well, okay, so then this is
So
where
what would
the
you
other
say?
phrase comes in, right? So rather than talking about spiritual abuse, where we're coming at it from a victim-centered perspective, we come at it from the idea of sexual responsibility, where no one is let off the hook. And definitely the scholars are not let off the hook, right? Those who have more knowledge and those who have more effect have even more responsibility than those who do not. Right. So going back to that example you said in the beginning where, okay, there's a woman who, she's not dressed exactly right. And she goes to a scholar to ask him something. Well, if you are going to allow yourself to be put in a position where you're going to represent the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there are people out there in the world who do not practice the deen at the level that they should be. This is not just in our day. This is historically, we know that there are people out there who are not 100% always. This is what Tawbah is about. This is what making,
And this
turning
is
back
why
to
you make
Allah is about.
dawah.
Huh?
And this is why you're making dawah.
This is why you're making dawah and teaching people in the first place, so that they can come to a better practice of the deen. And, if you are not equipped internally within yourself to hold yourself back from someone who is not dressed appropriately, then perhaps you should excuse yourself from the position. Right? So, what I mean by that is, if we talk about this instead as sexual responsibility, we're talking then from a position of positive action rather than negative reaction. I think it's a much more empowering. I mean, I don't like that term. We could talk about why if you want later, but like, it's better to talk about what needs to be done rather than what needs to be done for good to happen rather than what needs to be done so that bad doesn't happen. And I don't mean to say that we shouldn't talk about what needs to be done so bad doesn't happen, because that's nahy anil munkar, right? Like that's forbidding the evil. Definitely we need to do that. But if that's our primary way of talking about, or the only way, so where do we see any conversation about the relationship between the ulama and their students in American Muslim discourse? Do we see much about it? Not really, I don't think. And then now that we are really focusing on that relationship, we're talking about it in negative terms. Let's make sure no spiritual abuse happens. I think it's more conducive to positive action and positive step taking for us to talk about responsibility. And what I mean by sexual responsibility is basically we need to have taqwa in our interactions where there is some sexual tension, meaning some kind of boundary or some kind of sexual line could be crossed between two individuals. At that place is where you are now called upon to have sexual responsibility. You need to know, what is the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? I have to meet this man at his office for work. And we need to have an hour-long discussion about this big problem that's happening between our two companies. What am I going to do to make sure I am following, for example, the rules of khalwa in the Sharia, where I'm not in unlawful seclusion, I'm not alone with this person? What am I going to do to make sure that I am dressed appropriately so that I am not calling attention to myself in a way that would put me in a vulnerable position? How do I make sure that if has to be frequency of communication between myself and this person, how do I mitigate any familiarity to develop with that frequency of communication, right? These are steps that I as a woman can take. Now,
Also, like, realizing that before he's a scholar, he's a man. So, like, yes, I'm talking to Sheikh, I'm going to him for help, but also,
yeah,
he's a human. He's
a human being.
like, what do I have to do to protect myself in the situation when I'm talking to any man? And then he's a scholar after that.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point, because a lot of us we might sometimes actually have too much of a high opinion of our
Yes,
scholars.
yes.
If that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Like,
like he's a
he's a
scholar.
scholar. How
Yeah.
could he would never look at me like that. He would never talk to me like that. He would never do it. And then all of a sudden something happened and you're like, oh my gosh, he
And then
must
now
not be
he's
a
a
scholar.
shaitan.
It's just
Yeah.
like, no, let's,
Yeah. He went from the scholar to to being the worst villain.
Right. And I've
It's also I
mm,
remember. Sorry, go ahead.
no, you go.
I remember that. Oh, I totally slipped my mind. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, so, we need to carry ourselves with responsibility. By talking about sexual responsibility, it puts the onus on each one of us to do our part in creating a sexually healthy society where things are not going off, where things are not, where their interactions are to the highest degree possible, in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're never going to create a utopia on earth. We know that. But how do we aim for the best possible result? By doing what Allah commands. I mean, that's the whole point of the Sharia, right? That's what I meant when I said earlier, if we weren't human, there wouldn't be Islam. I mean, we need, in order to regulate us, not only to help us to make the right choices and to to sort of do what is ultimately better for us in this world and next, we need to follow the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this term, sexual responsibility, is exactly calling to that. That you as a scholar need to be doing your job. I as a woman need to be doing my job. Parents need to be doing their job so that they are, keeping an eye on what's happening with their children and who's interacting with their children, so that their children know, listen, this is not supposed to ever happen between you and somebody, regardless of who that person is, right? These kinds of things, like, that's the sexual responsibility of the parent, right? I mean, I know of mothers from very traditional backgrounds, not even Western, Muslim backgrounds, who will have very open conversations about these things with their little kids. Like, I know a family where they will teach the children in the family, from when you're 2 years old, you don't sit in anyone's lap after you're 2. And the child is just like, oh, because I'm big now, I'm more than 2, so I'm not a baby anymore, and I'm not going to sit on anybody's lap, right? So, like, for them, it's like, I'm more responsible. What is a 2-year-old going to understand about why you're not supposed to sit in the lap? This much that 2-year-old can understand. You're big now. You're not supposed to be doing that. Don't you? Why are you acting like a baby? And the child will be like, no, I'm not a baby, right? So they're taught from that little of an age. But everyone who's an adult understands why that rule is in place. That rule is in place so that nothing funny happens,
Yeah,
right?
you can't just like grab someone's kid and throw him in your lap. The kid's gonna know this is weird. Feel uncomfortable. Jump up.
Yeah, and it could very well be that there's someone who's innocuously, like, innocently loves the kid and wants to put him in his lap and give him a hug or give her a hug, and that's fine. But sorry, like, in our family, these people will say we don't do it that way, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can put your hand on the child's head, and he can sit next to you when you do that. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're not, even though we trust you, and even though we've invited you because you are our guest, or you are a relative, or you are our sheikh, or you are whoever respected member of our gathering right now, but this is something, and nobody has to be offended if the child is taught from that little of an age. No one has to really do much. The child just
we
says, "Excuse me," and just gets off the lap.
we had an incident like where my daughter was young, and like an uncle, like a relative, just grabbed her and put her in her lap, and she was looking at me like, what do I do? Because we had this talk in private, like, if you don't sit in anyone's lap, you're too big for that. You have to jump off.
Oh.
And then but
How old
she
was
was
she?
at that time she was 6 actually,
Mm.
but she was looking at me for help and kind of struggling to say it herself.
Mm.
And so I said, oh, we don't sit in laps anymore. We talked about how they're too big for that. And so the relative was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Like, like he respected it and he appreciated it. And, even though it was like an awkward moment, in the end, you could tell he respected it. My daughter felt like she needed someone to speak for her in the moment. And so it kind of just like sometimes you have to just have those awkward conversations or with your kids, with your relatives, with people around you.
So yeah, I had the same kind of thing happen when I was younger. I remember we went to, I don't even remember. It was so long ago. I don't remember why we were there. We were at some kind of a restaurant table, and a relative of ours had invited us, I think, and he had a local Quran teacher who's his friend also there present. This is in Chicago, and I don't even remember who these people were. I was really young, and the Quran teacher person, my sister was really little, and she was he was like, oh, she's so cute, and like he picked her up and put her on his lap, and I was like, I just didn't like, I don't know what it was. I didn't like something about it, and I looked over and I was like, get off of his lap. I just told her, you need to come sit over here right now, and it was and it was awkward. I felt awkward doing that, but
Yeah.
we have
I
to
mean,
do it, and it's not easy. Definitely not easy.
people can genuinely have a really good intentions. Like, the percentage of abusers versus people who are good is very small, alhamdulillah, but it's just protocol, like social protocol. When we started hijab, and I remember having this conversation with a teacher about hijab is also a protection of family, and in a way it's also an act of sisterhood because you're guarding your modesty to also not create fitna in someone else's home. And so,
Wow.
and so like when
You're guarding your modesty so you don't create fitna in someone else, some
in
other woman's home,
some
meaning
other
because you
woman's
could
home.
become a fitna for her husband.
And so
Wow, mashallah.
it reminded me like how it's also, you know, imagine the wife of these scholars, like, he's giving so much time to the community, meeting after meeting, time after time, people pouring their hearts out to them. It's a lot for her to also put up with, right? Because we're as women, we're very possessive of our men. Like the one thing that will rile up every woman is a joke about like, what if if your husband jokes about taking a second wife or this or that. Like, we're so possessive even in our humor. Imagine like the wives of these scholars are I mean, particular male scholars, or even the husbands of the female scholars, like they're tolerating a lot of interactions that the average spouse would be uncomfortable with, that they wouldn't like. And I was talking to this one young girl one time, and she was telling me about how this one scholar is helping her with the problem she's having, and she's having these long conversations and emotional conversations, pouring her heart out. And this person's like wife was actually absent for some reason at the time. And I was telling her, I think you should be careful. He's away from his wife, and you're spending an awful lot of time confiding in him. Perhaps it's not a, you need to just be careful. And at the moment when I said that, she thought I was being so extreme or so ridiculous. But later, it started to reveal itself to her that, hey, I need to stop. I maybe, so like, also, if you could just kind of like maybe talk about, I know we had talked about this in other conversations, but the frequency of how often you're talking and the nature of how you're sharing, like even your concerns matters.
Wait, you're saying we should talk more about the
If you could
problem
talk about
of having
how,
frequency.
yeah, frequency, and also in the manner of like, like, am I going to present the same issue in front of a male scholar that I would a female scholar? Like, perhaps there'd be simpler than the way I'm even communicating what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think both points that you're saying are true. One issue you're bringing up is frequency. The other is the appropriateness of what you're asking about, right?
Yeah, or even the manner and the way that it's asked.
Like what? What do you mean?
So let's say hypothetically someone is having marital issues, right? So do I go directly and ask the masla, like, or do I talk about my feelings? And, like, at what part do I differentiate that I'm asking for scholarly advice versus looking for emotional
Counseling.
support?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a number of things we could talk about. Number one, regarding the second part of what you're asking, in a traditional society, if there's a problem between a man and a woman, they don't go to first right away to a scholar to discuss the problem. I mean, even what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in the Quran? You take a hakaman min ahliha, hakaman min ahlihi, wa hakaman min ahliha, right? Like an arbitrator from her side, his side, and an arbitrator from her side. And, you come together and you sort of talk it out as families, and unfortunately, the unfortunate reality for us is that as a society that is becoming more and more individualized, we're living at more and more individualistic existences where, we're not really extended family. We don't identify as extended family, definitely not as tribes, and definitely even as extended family, a lot of us don't really see that as an essential part of us. Like my broader family network is just sort of they're there. I have some aunts and uncles, I have some cousins. They live somewhere in the next other part of the country, and we see them once in a while at weddings, that kind of thing. Not I could call them up if I have a problem, which is really unfortunate. And this is for people who are born Muslim. I mean, people who are converts are not going to have that at all, because how are you going to call in a family member who's going to understand the ideals of the deen and what we should be living up to? So, we're supposed to be having these kinds of emotional pain, like the places when we're in pain. Where are we supposed to be letting that out? Between families, first and foremost. And we just don't socially have that set up often anymore. And so, what then is happening is we are going instead to the person who we think is next best equipped to think clearly about what needs to be done from a proper perspective, a religious, God-centered, God-directed perspective. And so we go to our scholars. But personally, I don't think it's the job of scholars to mediate our problems, our marital problems, or so, these kinds of very intimate problems. And, if we were to be people who had, friends, if we had, so this is another issue. It's like, how can when do we sort of unburden our hearts in front of our friends? It's a very sensitive matter, because generally it's not a good idea to talk about all your problems to anyone other than someone who can solve the problem. If you know that the person can help you solve the problem, sort of figure out what's going on and give you really good advice, someone who comes herself from a good marital background, who has like a good head on her shoulders, who's a balanced person. You don't want to go to someone who is herself struggling to maintain her marriage and doesn't really know how to maintain her relationships, and you're going to ask her about yours, right? So a lot of times when that kind of a conversation is happening, it's just somebody venting. A sharia it's not a sharia oriented way of approaching the problem. So, do we make sure to have righteous friends and company and suhbah of women who we can go to for good advice? Do we try to, sometimes it is that in our families, there are people present who would help us arbitrate and mediate and help us, improve things. But because that culture of going to your family member isn't there, we don't think about doing that. Like, for example, I know of a family where the, there were, uh, someone's parents were aging, right? And they were getting really old, and they couldn't quite figure out how to, help figure out how to do their living arrangements as they're aging, right? And so rather than with like the way that they went about this, rather than trying to sort of just siblings. There's a couple, only two, a couple of siblings who weren't really that capable of providing all of the help that the parents needed. They brought in the older cousins from the family, could you guys help us out? Give us some advice. We're trying to figure out what to do. Our father doesn't want this. Our mother wants it this way. And neither one's coming to agreement. And we feel really guilty. They need to they need to be in a better situation because they're getting too old to be on their own. And the cousins really stepped in. They were like the older male cousins. They stepped in. They talked to the parents, both of the elderly people, bringing in kind of a third party so that it's not this parent-child relationship, where the parents just like, oh, you guys, you don't know what you're talking about. Your mother and I don't need this right now. We're completely capable. If it's very easy, the parent always sees the child as a child. But when they bring someone else out, it's like, oh, this is a serious conversation. I need to be we need to really think about what these guys are putting in front of us now. So they brought this kind of a help in from the extended family, from their kin, but that's not normal. I mean, in their community circle where they live in America, like people don't really do that. Those cousins live far away in a different city. And yet when they called on them for help, they showed up, and so I think even just looking to those kinds of traditional avenues first, you need to, as you mentioned, I think Fatma, you made a really good point. Like, do we just put the mas'ala? Do we just ask the question? Like, this is the situation. What needs to be done? Is that what needs to be put in front of the scholar? Or, and then this happened, and then I felt like this, and it was really horrible. And I'm like, I can't believe this. I'm in this position now. I never in my 40 years of life ever imagined that this would happen to me. He's doing this to me, and he's doing that to me. You're putting your guard down in those situations. And when you start talking like that, it automatically necessitates further need of conversation, further sessions, therefore increased frequency of talking, therefore greater familiarity. And, men have a tendency to sort of want to protect women from harm. I mean, it's sort of like it's a thing if they're righteous, if they're, let's say, a valier type of guy, right? Like somebody who's valiant. They're gonna want to step in and help her out. When that thing kicks in, then it's like her affection sort of growing, like, oh, he really cares. It's really problematic. I mean, I heard
Yeah.
another scholar recently saying, we're not going to do counseling in our circle of scholars. We're just not going to do counseling. So don't even come to us for counseling. And I thought that was really amazing that they would think
Yeah.
about that even.
It also like when you like when you have to condense what you're saying, you realize, like, for example, when I have to email my sheikh, I have to keep it under 400 words, and so I'm editing and editing and editing and realizing, oh
Wait,
wow,
what? When you're emailing your sheikh, what do you mean?
for advice, right? There's
Oh, when you're emailing your actual sheikh.
my actual sheikh for advice.
Oh,
The
I
rule,
see.
the rule is stay within 400 words, and I'm realizing when I'm editing, like, how much extra emotion I've added to this email.
Yeah.
Right, and
SubhanAllah,
unless you have
SubhanAllah.
parameters and boundaries, in this case, the sheikh himself is like, these are the parameters, and this is what you have to follow. And there's parameters on frequency as well. But
Mm-hmm.
but when you're making that type of edit, you realize, oh wow, I didn't realize that I didn't hit the masla, or I didn't hit the actual topic. I added all these emotional
Extraneous
embellishments, so
thing.
to speak, yeah, that were not necessary.
Right.
And sometimes, like, if you're not, if you're, this sheikh is being kind, he's not putting his foot down, he's, he doesn't want to hurt people's feelings, then it's also eating up all of his time and his family's time to keep going back. So, because sometimes people are coming back, getting the same advice again and again and again, and not
Mm-hmm.
following it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so many. I mean, it might sound like we're hitting on so many random tangents here and there, but it
Mm-hmm.
all is coming back to responsibility
Yeah.
for yourself and for the leadership.
And what's interesting is if you think about it, Fatma, like the idea of responsibility or sexual responsibility, it's not, it's coming at it from in a positive way, but that doesn't mean it doesn't call out negative behavior, right? So sexual responsibility if you're going to say, as a community, we uphold sexual responsibility, number one, it gives the impression, which impressions are important, it gives the impression that this is a proactive community, right? Number two, that this community trusts, interacts with each other from a basis of trust, not from a basis of mistrust. If you say we uphold a stance against spiritual abuse, what is communicated is we know that there's always this possibility of someone abusing us, and so we are going to protect ourselves from that. If you say we are a community who upholds sexual responsibility, it is we uphold the requirement of us doing the right thing. We expect that from each other, and we believe that most of us can do it. You see what I'm saying? So it's like it's just much more confidence building for the community as a whole. Like, you just come off, when you're listening to someone speak at a lecture or a conference, or even if you're interviewing someone for an interview, like, you can tell the confident person, and you want to hire that confident person because you know that this person is cognizant of what needs to be done and is confident that those things can be done, right? That they seem more capable just because of their confidence, even though somebody who doesn't come off as confident, they might know all the stuff, they might know how to they have the same skills and all of that, but them lacking an aura of capability makes you distrust the fact that they even have that capability. Right? And if as a community we put forth this face of we are capable of upholding what Allah tells us to do, and we are capable of staying away from what He doesn't want us to do, and when we are weak, we're going to hold each other to account for that, it's a very different flavor to the conversation.
Different mindset. Like, we're also not making excuses, right, for people in power. We're not making excuses that, like even in our mind, or overlooking mistakes. I had a new girl one time. She was seeking advice from a scholar online.
You knew a girl?
Yeah. So she was emailing him for advice, and someone said, recommended, this is a really good person. They helped my family very much, etc. You should email him. So she emails him her question, and he helps her. And then there's a second correspondence, and he asks, well, could you send me a picture? It would help me.
Whoa.
It would help me address your masla better. And immediately she's like, this person you recommended me to is a farce. Beware. Do not recommend him again.
Good. Yeah.
But right in the moment, you're like, she's not going to make excuses, regardless of the fact that people are swearing by his, his effectiveness, his validity. He's amazing. He did all this for us, and she's like, by the way, maybe you shouldn't recommend this again. And she stopped herself in the tracks and.
But that says also a lot about her having a bare minimum level of just understanding of the deen. And I think a part of sexual responsibility is gaining knowledge. Having just a basic understanding, and that gaining knowledge thing, people might think, oh, you mean like go to the ulama and they're going to teach you, but they're going to teach you what they want. No, I mean parents who have been through 30, 40, 50 years of practicing their Islam are the ones who are going to be inculcating the basics of this to the child from a very young age. When someone asks you for a picture for no reason, you say no. I mean, this is very hard to do in our day because pictures are everywhere, unfortunately, but our pictures. But it tells you that she knew something about the deen enough that she knew where to draw the line, even if it was a quote unquote scholar was asking her to cross that line.
When your children are going through puberty, there's so many uncomfortable conversations you just have to keep having. And I remember when I was growing up,
even before puberty.
Yeah, even before puberty. These are things I would hate these conversations with my mom. I would hate these like tidbits of advice I would get. But then as I got older and I learned more about the world, I was so appreciative of it. I was so grateful.
Like what?
Like she would say, I remember this when I was I was in high school, actually. So I should have these conversations when we were very young, actually. But one specific conversation I thought was so unique, and she sat me down and she said, you have to practice extra modesty around your older male relatives, even those in their 30s and 40s that are, around your father's age.
Wow.
Or the ones that, they're close uncles, older cousins that are fatherly older cousins, etc. And she would say, no, you have to, and I remember she
Oh,
would
that's
say,
really beautiful.
you have to
And
practice.
unfortunately, like now, if you were to say that to a 13-year-old or some, someone in our community hears this conversation between a mother and daughter, be like, oh, they must still have some funny
But
relatives. But it has nothing to do with the
no,
relatives.
it
I
has
mean,
nothing to
anybody
do with
who
that.
has life experience understands this is a very wise thing, even when the relatives are excellent.
Yeah, because,
Mashallah.
well, now that you're older and you think about it, she particularly said people in their 30s and 40s, right? And now when you realize, like, people in their 30s and 40s, and
Mashallah.
looking back, these are people who've been married for a long time. These are
Right.
people who have different set of struggles in their marriages. And
Subhanallah.
you don't need, what she was trying to tell me, that perhaps they can have they can be susceptible to a different kind of fitna around younger women. And it's a
Wow.
really awkward thing to say, right, out loud. It's a really awkward thing to talk, like, what kind of relatives do you have? Like, what kind of family you're part of? But, like, no,
Yeah,
she's
no.
she's speaking to the raw human fitra. She's speaking to my raw human fitra of wanting to be
Cute.
recognized, right, as a female for her beauty. She's speaking to the raw human fitra of, men around younger women at a certain age group. And it's like, we're very politically correct in our hearts in America. We're very politically correct in our conversations. We don't have these very raw conversations with our kids. Like, yeah, and she would even tell me, like, even as a teacher, when you're interacting with younger boys, like, don't think, oh, they see me as a mom. Like, don't think, they see you as such and such. Like, I mean, she would have a lot of very, very raw, open conversations about modesty in so many areas that made a
They're
lot,
really
it
lucky.
didn't make sense at the time. They made a lot more sense later.
Yeah, no, that's a huge credit to your mom because, it shows her wisdom. It shows her courage to be able to talk about something very difficult. And she, managed to do it in a way where she didn't poison you against your male relatives. You still love them, and they're
Yeah,
amazing people. I mean, I
and
know some of your
respected them
relatives.
very
I
much.
know, like,
Yeah, yeah.
how amazing, mashallah, tabarakallah, your family is. But how does a pious religious family maintain their religiosity by having these kind of raw conversations so that fitna doesn't happen?
You get older and then you hear stories like, oh, like, like, someone says, oh, I had this situation and this happened and this happened, and then make these connections, like, oh, wow, like, these were the scenarios that they were mindful of, and they were trying to prevent our elders. And but I remember, like, when children are young and you're having these conversations, they're gonna say, mom, this is so cringe, this is so uncomfortable, like, I just want this conversation to end. But sometimes you just have to plow through them, because who else is going to do that for you other than your parents
Yeah.
or your close relatives?
I mean, okay, so but when we started this conversation, we're talking now generally about sexual responsibility, but if we're talking specifically about ulama, even in the arena of talking about ulama, I think that we do need to talk about sexual responsibility, or they need to talk about sexual responsibility amongst themselves. Like, so for example, there's this thing I was reading an excerpt the other day about from one of the early 19th century scholars from the Indian subcontinent. His name is Ashraf Ali Tanvi. You've heard of him, Mulana Tanvi, right? He's like very well known from the Desi community in that era. So he was writing about. He was speaking actually. I think this was like a transcript of one of his talks, and he was telling his disciples and his students and people who were present that scholars he actually said they have a greater responsibility of making sure to practice the deen, because when they don't practice the deen and they're like lax in their practice, then he said there's two types of negative effects that can happen. Number one, the awam, or like the regular folks, when they look at him and they see him kind of lax in his upholding, let's say, of sexual responsibility, then they too will become that way, And then the second problem is when if the people know what is correct practice and they see him not doing that, then they will start developing a negative opinion of the ulama, and that inevitably, regardless of what we say, that leads to a negative opinion eventually of the deen itself. Like that, because the ulama, the Prophet ﷺ said that the ulama are the inheritors of the prophets. So, they are carrying the inheritance, they are carrying the mirath of the religion. If you don't do that right, you're going to mess up the way people look at the deen. So he actually said, if they don't practice what they preach, the ulama, they actually fall under the statement of Allah in the Quran, those who block people from the way, yasudduna an sabil, like those ulama, they're teaching the deen, but they're actually blocking people from the deen. And he said it's because, okay, fine, there's direct blocking. You hold someone away from it. And then there's indirect blocking where you become the means for people to not want to go in that direction. I mean, I think when I'm saying that I'm uncomfortable with the term spiritual abuse, I just basically what I wish for people to think about is think about what kind of a general sense of who we are as a community and what we expect from our scholars. What is that phrase communicating? And wouldn't it be better if we use the term sexual responsibility? That term, again, like I said, it was from a different article that I wrote. It's on Stilla's website. But I think it has the same positive effects, and it can prevent us from developing a negative attitude toward the ulama. And sexual responsibility also gives us the tools to call out ulama without calling out, no, it gives us the tools to call out the lone bad actors among ulama without demeaning or depreciating the value of spiritual inheritors and their knowledge inheritors of the deen as a whole. Does that make sense?
It does. And also, we didn't mention this, but spiritual abuse comes from the Christian community, right?
Oh, no.
This term.
Oh, the term.
So, yeah, like the term spiritual abuse stems from the clergy and all of the abuses in there. And
yeah, the term was coined, it's not originally coined by the Muslim American community.
Yeah,
it was already there among Christians.
It's dangerous to apply these things, like slap them onto our community.
Absolutely. Without thinking it through.
Yeah.
I mean, basically what I'm asking is that we think it through. I realize that those who are actually, the imams of large masjids, huge flocks of people under their care, they are the the shepherds. The Prophet ﷺ said, each of you is a shepherd and you're responsible for your flock. So they understand what needs to be done and what needs to be said. And, I'm speaking sort of from a different kind of more theoretical place, just not as a critique, but as a way to just ask us to think more carefully about what we're doing. And that's a really good point that you made, that, that term, if it comes from the Christian community, which I think it does come from the Christian community. I don't know the history of how it entered their language, but I think that there's probably a level of liberalism that is affecting the Christians who also adopted that term. That maybe the more traditional minded Christian wouldn't use. Also, they might also not want to use the term spiritual abuse. But okay, right now, Fatma, I need to pray Maghrib.
We've been talking for some time, and I think redefining at the end was really helpful. So until next time,
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.
Thank you for joining us today on the Connections podcast. To stay updated on the work we do at the Silla Initiative, sign up for our newsletter at the bottom of our homepage at thesillainitiative.org. You can also subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Telegram, or follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.